everyone. Today I'm going to show you how I changed my plain front on the 1837 everyday shirt into a front that has a yoke that you can put on the diagonal and a separate button placket so that you can do a contrast fabric. So I've matched my collar to the button band this time, and this button band sort of wraps around so that it is equal on the right side and the wrong side. So today I'm going to show you how I cut the pattern pieces so that I ended up with a yoke and a button band. So just before I get into that, I'd just like to show you another shirt that I made with the front yoke. This one is silk with a broderie anglaise overlay on the front yoke, and I used the matching fabric for the button band this time. And I don't even put buttons on my shirts anymore. I think as far as doll's clothes go, if you really want to highlight the design, you can put different coloured buttons, but I think the shirt looks just fine without any buttons. So this one has the silk in behind for the inside yoke and the broderie anglaise on the outside, and this is separate trim that I sewed on. So this is the shirt, the same shirt pattern, but it's all in one colour. And I highlighted the front yokes with the eyelet fabric. I also did the back yoke on this one as well. So that's the finish you can get by cutting the plain front into a yoke and a separate button band. So here I have the front of the 1837 everyday shirt, and I'm going to cut this to make a yoke and a lower front and a button band. So you need two copies of the same piece. Now, because we're adding another seam in here, we're going to have to make a little tiny adjustment for the fold of cloth. So because I'm adding the seam, I'm adding an extra fold to the front here, so I need to add just a tiny bit. Now I sort of work in both millimeters and inches, but if you look at the millimeters on my measuring tape, it's barely like double the width of the line on here. So all we're going to do is basically move the center front line so that it becomes a distinct line just towards the button band. So this is going to be the new cutting line for my front. You could probably go just a fraction further. You need to be able to see that it's a distinct line. So basically we're adding the width of the folded edge of a piece of fabric. So my new cutting line has moved from this side to this side, just about 1 millimeter in width. So now I'm going to cut off the button band along that line. So we have to do that because if you don't do anything, you shrink the neckline by a fraction. So that's why we have to make it just a fraction wider. to account for the fold in the neckline there. So now we have our piece ready to mark the front yoke. So all you need is to just judge by eye about halfway down. So halfway down, say about here. And we're going to draw a line. Now this particular line is going to be the seam line for the yoke. So I'm going to do it in a dashed line to indicate it's the seam line. And if that's the seam line for the yoke, then we need a seam allowance. So I'll do my seam allowance, 1/4 inch from the seam line. Okay, so now we've got the yoke sorted out. You can see how we need 2 pieces because the seam line for the yoke is the same as the seam line for the lower front. But when you add the seam allowance on, you've got to cut off some of the lower front. So if we cut off the yoke here, and now we just cut it out. Okay, so there's the yoke piece done. So we can't use this piece anymore. So we just make sure that doesn't get used again. So you can add grain lines to your fabric, to your pattern piece, particularly if you want to cut it on the bias. It helps if you have the grain lines drawn in. So I'm just going to do a little, like a compass rose almost, so that I can get my bias line in the right place. So 45 degrees, so I'm just going to judge that. So if you want to cut this on the bias, you would use that as your grain line. So put that one aside, and now we'll do the lower front. So we need to just fix our cutting line here. So the cutting line, oh sorry, I forgot to point out here that we need, this is the cutting line, so we're going to do 1/4 inch in for the seam line where the button band goes on. So we're going to have to do a new cutting line on this one, just a fraction from the center front line. That one was pretty good. You can just see there's a tiny gap between the 2 lines. So that's our new cutting line. And you do it on the center front because the button band sort of wraps around behind. So from here we're going to cut off the button band along that new line that we drew. So unfortunately, you can't use either of our button bands off that piece. We'll have to have a third piece to develop the button band because we have to increase the cutting line across the other way. Okay, so now we've got the piece that we're going to make the lower front from. So we just have to make sure our line will end up in the same place for our seam line. So I'm just going to put a little mark to make sure my seam line ends up in the same place. And dash in my seam line. Looks a little crooked, doesn't it? Crikey. Okay, that's better. So this time we're making the lower front. So we're going to need to increase the seam allowance to the other side. So I place my 1/4 inch mark on the seam line and I draw in the seam allowance. So this time we're going to cut along our new cutting line here and throw away the top bit. So the next thing we need to do is put in our seam line for the front, and that goes down here. So this is not the center front anymore. This is the button band seam. Okay, so now we have a lower front and a yoke. So we'll just cut this one out. Okay, so there's 2 of our pattern pieces that we need for the front. Next we're going to do a similar thing to get the button band the right width. So I've printed out a 3rd piece so that I can do the button band. This time I'm going to use the center front line and go to the bodice side of it, so that I increase the, I might try to go this way. So we're increasing the width of the button band by just under 1 millimeter, just so you can see that there is a tiny bit of space between the original line and the new line that you drew. And this time I'm going to cut off the button band along my new line. Okay, and we don't need this piece anymore. Now to make the button band fold behind as well as in front, we have to increase the width of the button band. So the seam line becomes 1/4 inch in from our new line. So that will be the seam line joins to the front, but we have to extend this out 1/2 inch. So where I've cut the button band off the front, I haven't added any seam allowance. I've just put the seam line 1/4 inch back from the cut. So we have to add 1/2 inch to our button band so that it keeps the width of the front the same. trust me. It sounds complicated, but it's not that hard. So we're going to add a 1/2 inch, go this way, to the side of the button band. I'll just draw a line. So this is the new cutting line for the button band. It's going to go straight across the bottom. And we're going to put another zag in our zigzag top so that when it all folds together, it matches the shape of the neck. So it's going to be the same height as this one. So we're just going to zag it up. So there's our new line. And when we cut this one out, follow the zags and the zigs. I find that if you put in the zigzags, it's just easier to tell where you need to fold it. You don't have to measure your 1/2 inch pedantically. You can just use the points on the zigzag to work out where it folds. Okay, so now we have the button band, the lower front, and the yoke from our original piece that was all one piece. So it's quite easy to redraft patterns from a pattern that already fits. You just have to remember the turn of cloth, so you might need to make things a fraction bigger. Not a great deal, but just a little bit so that they fit together. You probably won't find that there's a problem here because it's only one seam, whereas in the neck, we had to make sure the neck was the right size because there was a seam here and there will be another seam on the other side of the neck. So that's enough to just change the size of your neck a fraction. So that's why we adjusted this particular seam and not this one, because that's just one seam and it probably won't make enough difference to worry about. So that's the front hack. And this is how it turns out. Okay, so you've got the separate button band and you have the front yoke.